here's how I made the hand-painted titles for my course. I didn't go straight into making these titles. It was actually inspired by a different experiment that I did for a workshop I was running in a school, where I wanted to show students how they could animate, on pieces of tracing paper and understand some of the ideas and techniques behind animation without having to learn a bunch of software. So we got all these pieces of tracing paper, and this was my kind of practice demo I did at home. I did this really simple little pose-to-pose animation where I just planned out some of the frames and then in between them on bits of paper. It was really fun because it was kind of simple and straightforward, got a bit messy, so I made sure to eventually go and number all of the different frames, because that made it easier once I was scanning it back in. But it was a fun test. I decided to scan it in and composite it to make sure that the technique would work. So I used After Effects for my compositing, which is what I'm always going to use. You could try, some other software. I actually had a go at using Stop Motion Studio, which is an iPhone app or just a phone app, to photograph it to see if it worked, and it actually did. But obviously, if you want to do a proper job, After Effects is the way to go. And I liked how it was looking, so I decided to just colour it in with gouache, which is my favourite. The same as I would with any project, I went through and did one colour at a time. And then I went through with darker colours and I think a lighter colour as well, and I did, shadows and highlights. I wasn't worried about this being really perfect because it was an experiment, which is, sort of the best way to work. If you can get into the mindset of things being an experiment and not something that you have to be perfect on, then it's great. I also, after this, went through and actually added some little kind of yellow blobs around the edge using the straight ahead technique. So I just drew one, then guessed the next frame and so on. And I composited both versions in After Effects again, and this is how they turned out. I think they're really cute. I was really pleased with them as a kind of half a day experiment, and the idea of tracing paper was stuck in my head after this point. So when it came to making these titles, I actually made them first in Photoshop, of course, that's what I always make my work in, and it was halfway through making these titles, I was just going to leave them as a Photoshop thing, that I realised it just felt totally wrong to not hand paint them. How can I have a course about hand painting and not have hand painted titles? So I decided instead I was going to print them out and I was going to paint them on tracing paper because I thought it could overlay over the rest of the text in the title. So I made a bunch of contact sheets as usual, and then I printed out every single frame, and then I stuck down all of the pieces to paper. I used masking tape here, and I always say that you should use frog tape, and that's not wrong. Masking tape is a bad idea. I was just too lazy to go to the shops. This was really slow. The time lapse doesn't really do it justice. I think it was about 5 minutes per frame for these kind of full written ones. And I tried to be neat, but ultimately you can't be that neat when you're doing little line work like this, and the reason you want things to be hand painted is because you want those natural little imperfections. So I let it go. If I smudged it, if I messed up, it adds to it, it's fine. If you really hate it, you can edit it in Photoshop later. When I got to these little frames where the text was nearly gone, that was way more satisfying. And then I unpicked every frame and I numbered them in pencil. I like it when the pencil marks show, so I wasn't worried about it showing up. Then I scanned them in. If I was going to do this again, I might actually scan them and just do one per page or maybe two per page so that I could see the edges, because I think having the edges of the paper could have looked really nice, but I didn't, and realistically I am not going to go back and do it again. And then I composited it in After Effects. I like this bit, just rotating it around, scaling it. Once I've got the scale, I keep it all at the same scale. As usual, with a bit of help from Ziggy, he's very considerate. I had to do a bit of work to get the textures of the paper working over the rest of the frame. I kind of masked it out and feathered it a bit so that it was, less obvious. And I also created this background texture from a scan of just some tracing paper that I did, and I moved it around each frame so it has this kind of appearance of boiling. But yeah, this is the outcome. I'm really pleased with it. I think it's subtle, but in my eyes it's worth the effort.